everyone, this is Amanda Borschel-Dan.
And I'm Jessica Steinberg,
your host for Times Will Tell,
a weekly podcast from the Times of Israel.
Hi everyone, this is Amanda Borschel-Dan. This week, I'm so excited to shed light on women's lives in ancient Israel through a fascinating conversation with Professor Jennie Ebeling. In addition to leading and participating in archaeological excavations in Israel and Jordan, Jennie is sculpting the next generation of scholars through her teaching at the University of Evansville in Indiana. She has written extensively about food and drink technology, which offers a deeper look at the role of women in antiquity. She discusses this in her book, Women's Lives in Biblical Times, and we talk about a typical day in the life of an Israelite woman. One of the ways we can learn about women's agency, she says, is through studying ancient ovens. This, in part, has led Jennie to hypothesize that women were the master brewers of the ancient Israel. Let's hear more. Hi, Jennie. Thank you so much for joining me. Such a pleasure having you. Where am I finding you today?
Hi, I'm in Evansville, Indiana, and I'm in my office in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Evansville.
Okay, you are a person who wears many different hats. Please tell us some of them, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, I'm an associate professor of archaeology here, and I have co-directed the excavations at Jezreel from 2012 to 2018 with my colleague Norma Franklin of the University of Haifa, and I'm continuing to work on the analysis and publication of that project. And I do various other things to support archaeology and spreading the word about archaeological discoveries to the public. And also, I focus a lot on undergraduate education in archaeology and trying to get students experiences in the field and in the lab and in museums.
So we are here to talk about women, not in terms of being archaeologists, such as you are, but more the other side of the shovel, the women of yore, shall we say, the women of the ancient world. And one of the ways we'll discuss that is that you have a theory, a hypothesis at least, that women were the master brewers of ancient Israel. So before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit about how we know what women's roles were way back in ancient Israel?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and it's been the focus of more attention in recent years than it has in the past. So one source, of course, that people have traditionally looked to is the text, is the Hebrew Bible, to find out more about, women and women's lives. And as many know, it's a source that is limited, I guess you could say. So, there just isn't very much about women's lives, that comes through in the text, except sort of anecdotally here and there. So although that is an important source, I would argue that it's not the primary source. The primary source of information we have for people who lived during any period in the past is archaeological remains. Because this is relatively, unbiased and often in situ information, the remains that people left behind for us to uncover. So that's where most of our information about everyday life in ancient Israel is coming from archaeological remains. And in the case of women in particular, we're really fortunate that a lot of the activities that we believe, women were involved with on a daily basis, the correlates of those things preserve really well because they're often made of stone and clay, unlike, organic materials that don't survive very well. And so this leads us to the bread and beer and, the kind of what the evidence is for that kind of work at the domestic level in the Iron Age.
It's interesting that you say that archaeology is a relatively unbiased look, but of course the interpretation of your finding can be extremely biased based upon who you are, what your life view is. And so, for instance, shall we say a man who views one certain tool might not see the potential that perhaps a woman or somebody who may have used a tool of this nature may have. Talk about this a little bit too.
Right. Everything is subject to interpretation, right? whether it's textual material or archaeological or iconographic or ethnographic or really any other source of evidence. So that's definitely a good point that, we need to be careful about considering archaeological information, inherently unbiased because it doesn't speak. It's just sort of there, right? It's from the past. So we have to, as archaeologists and historians and others, interpret that stuff. So I think in the case of the kinds of tools and installations that I'm particularly interested in, there's been sort of a hole in research because this stuff was basically ignored until recent decades. And I'm not kidding. Like, this is the kind of stuff that when you go to archaeological sites, even today, you sometimes see these things sitting around on the sides and the bulk and the weeds, around sites that have been excavated. They just haven't even bothered to take them away and register them or anything in the case of groundstone. And then I found also in the case of ovens, they're so ubiquitous. They're found all over the place that people just sort of consider their uses to be self-evident and not very interesting and worthy of study. So I think that's more of the issue than, someone interpreting a stone as one thing and someone interpreting it as another. I think there's just not really been interest in looking at this stuff until relatively recently by just about anybody.
Now, you're talking about ovens and groundstones, and obviously these are related to bread production. And how do we know, however, that women were in charge of the bread production to begin with?
Yeah. So all the sources of evidence that we have suggest that women were really closely tied to grinding in antiquity. So bread production is something else because we know that, in neighboring regions like Egypt, where we have so much information, and then also, toward the east in Mesopotamia, that, men were making bread and brewing beer in commercial or industrial contexts. So the grinding, however, even in the iconographic material from Egypt in particular, usually shows women doing that activity. So that's the difference, is grinding versus making bread or making food generally. In the Hebrew Bible, there are only 2 references to men and boys grinding. All of the other references are about women and girls grinding. So it seems to be a very feminine, kind of associated activity. Bread, on the other hand, is different. It's more complex. There's different steps. It can take place in different areas. Bread can be made in different ways. There's really only one way to grind grain in ancient Israel. And, we have evidence for it all over the place. But bread, can be made in ovens. It can be made in embers. It can be made on plates or trays and, in other ways. So that's just a bigger topic, I guess, than the grinding. But basically, it's just sort of looking at all of the evidence that we have available from the text, from ethnography, from iconography, from neighboring regions to start to, build this picture of, who might have been responsible for different tasks, especially at the household level. We're not talking so much about, in commercial or industrial sorts of contexts.
So let's talk about a day in the life of the ancient Israelite woman. What would this have entailed? You get up with the sun or before and then?
Yeah. So, it's fun to think about, this sort of thing. And this is something that, I've been interested in doing, trying to imagine, from all the little bits and pieces of information that we have, trying to put together the story. And I should preface this by saying that, this is very generalizing. And just like, every person's life is different and everyone's experience is different today. So it was in antiquity. So it's really difficult to know what a typical or average, day would have looked like for an average person. But I think that, right, getting up early if you're living in a rural area, perhaps, and, you're the basis of your the local economy and your life is the agricultural cycle, then, preparing for that, whatever tasks need to be done that day, out in the fields or closer to home in the orchards or in the gardens or whatever it may be. And, taking care of whoever's that needs to be taken care of. Whether it be, babies, children, elderly, others in need, doing everything that you need to do to take care of those in your orbit. I think for women in particular, making food, preparing food for the day is something that probably took up hours of a typical day because bread was the staple food in the ancient Israelite diet, like it was for, Israel's neighbors and was in the region up until relatively recently. So before it was possible to buy flour, women basically had to grind this stuff or get it from somewhere else. And in the Iron Age, this could take up to several hours a day if you're feeding, all the kids in your family and your spouse and others, elderly, other people, other relatives living at home. This could take perhaps up to, it's been calculated, 3 hours per day just to grind the grain. And so women might have done this at home. They might have taken their equipment outside and maybe worked with others. There's some evidence that sort of thing was going on, that women in particular, were working together, doing these mundane, arduous tasks for hours a day. The same thing when it comes to ovens. I mean, some ovens are found indoors, some are found in courtyards, but we also find sometimes that larger ovens are found in more communal spaces, so that, like we see ethnographically, women in the neighborhood or different, women who are related that live in a particular area at a site, might be sharing an oven. And so again, this takes hours a day. So, I mean, they may be hanging around the oven and waiting their turn. And that's, a great opportunity to, catch up on news and gossip and, all socialize, take care of children, that sort of thing. So even though, there are many other things that women were doing during the day, I think food preparation was really at the center of that. And so all of those activities then, would have taken place in specific areas within houses and outside of them. And this is exactly what we see archaeologically.
And probably taking care of the livestock, if there was any, and things of that nature as well. But that too is centered around food. And, as a mother, I definitely understand the need to keep feeding the kids throughout the day, all the time throughout the day. But I have electricity and, thank God, a microwave. So it's a lot easier for me.
Right.
You talked about the different placement of the ovens being outside or in other places inside the houses. And I wonder, you have this paper that I got a sneak preview of, and you talk about how this makes a woman have a bit more agency. Talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, I found this really interesting. And, archaeologists have been reorienting in recent times from looking at, the elites and, the architecture that seemed to really excite biblical archaeologists of an earlier generation, sort of palaces and fortifications and public spaces and things like that. And they've been focusing more on the household. So household archaeology has been developing, in the region now for at least 20 years. And so we know a lot more now because people are paying much closer attention, to the minutia of daily life as is excavated in just everyday houses. So I and others, have been looking carefully in some of these rooms and houses and trying to reconstruct, how activities would have played out and how, certain spaces would have been used for sleeping maybe, or for stabling animals, or for, as a kitchen, as a space where there might be, more specialized activities going on as well, like production activities. So what interests me about ovens is that, number one, they've been overlooked as a source of information about daily life generally, but about women's lives specifically. Number two, ovens don't move around. So unlike all these other artifacts that, like pottery that people have been, really focused on traditionally, ovens stay put. And so, they're not going anywhere unless you physically remove them and all residues of them. So since the ethnographic information and other sources suggest that women are really closely tied to oven production and oven use, then it's an interesting question. Were women the ones who were actually building and installing these ovens in specific areas that they chose in houses and around houses, outside in courtyards, et cetera? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of, where they spent their time? How does this look like when we look at other artifacts that are found around ovens? Because it's shown by, various researchers who've looked at this carefully, that often other objects of daily life, like textile production tools, are found in close proximity to ovens, domestic pottery, and other things, that these really suggest that women were sort of like creating their own spaces that they were going to be spending hours a day in, so it makes sense that you would want to make ovens that are the right location, they're the right height for your body. The same thing with the grinding tools, I think that they were probably often made to order, if not by the women themselves, then by, people close to them, and women selected those that were going to work for them physically. I mean, if you're going to be working with a tool for hours a day, you're going to be, modifying it or making it so that it works for you. So yeah, that's what I've started to look at more closely lately, is where we can identify in archaeological contexts, women's agency in the placement of ovens. I mean, these very permanent features. And also one that might also continue on to include cisterns and pits and, storage areas and other installations in houses that that people have not been paying close attention to.
It, of course, makes sense what you're saying. Everything about it makes sense. It's just giving women much more, as you say, agency or a voice or a vote in what's going on in their lives than what perhaps we are, trained to think about in such ancient times. It makes women much more of a partner in the production of the household domestic product, shall we say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really brings them to life, and it brings them to the fore. And I mean, as I like to say often, that we're really lucky that the archaeological evidence really does preserve these activities. I mean, the evidence for these activities and not so much others. So, I mean, the archaeological past is dominated by stone and clay. And a lot of these things seem to correlate to women's lives. So it's like, looking for women, it's not that hard. I mean, it's everywhere. It's just a matter of recognizing it.
Hi, it's Sarah Tuttle Singer from the Times of Israel. Come join our community and support fast and fair independent journalism. You can sign up with the link at the bottom of every single article on the site.
Now, one of the things that is so predictably found in these Israelite houses is loom weights, or what have always been called loom weights, at least. And even when I've been on sites, archaeologists have pointed them out to me and say, here's some more loom weights. But maybe, just maybe, they're not actually loom weights, but at the same time, perhaps they are still part of a woman's world, shall we say. So tell us a little bit about what these loom weights maybe otherwise could be.
Yeah, I mean, there are specialists in ancient textile production who have looked at this really closely, the weights and sizes of these weights and their material and how those correlate to, what was being produced in the Iron Age. And we find lots and lots of loom weights, made of stone and clay in Iron Age context for sure. There's some of them, however, that are a bit different, that are basically more like balls, I guess, of clay that have a perforation that might be maybe a little bit more narrow, or it could vary, I guess. It really depends. But sometimes these things that have been identified as loom weights traditionally turn out to have other uses. And so fermentation stoppers, when they're found on the tops of, certain kinds of vessels that were used to seal them up while, wine in particular was fermenting usually, those things seem to resemble loom weights, actually. So, I mean, there's variation. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but I mean, I've seen examples that have been found in context, with vessels still sitting on top of vessels. And the idea is that the perforations in the middle would have been stuffed with some sort of, scrap of material or something like that, so the gases can escape during fermentation, but it would then block, insects and other things from getting in. So they look, a lot like these loom weights, but they're not. So the sizes and the weights of them vary considerably. And again, it shows the nuances, I guess, that are, you really need to know what you're looking at and have a lot of experience examining different types and studying this stuff in order to come up with the best interpretation for what they are.
But these bottle caps, as I like to think of them, may have been actually used by women as well, because you also have this theory that women were the master brewers of ancient Israel. And that's because, and I didn't even think about this before reading your paper, that beer could have been produced through bread. So what is this connection, the beer and bread connection here?
Yeah, one of the ways to make beer in antiquity was to make it from bread. So we find this in ancient Egypt and also in Mesopotamia, and it comes through in the archaeological remains and the iconography from models and tomb reliefs, and then also in textual sources that show that sometimes malted barley cakes were first baked, and then they were crumbled up and added to a vat of warm hot water along with yeast in order to brew beer. And, it was just one of the methods. I mean, there were other methods as well, but this seems to have been common. And so Egyptologist Delwyn Samuel has said, basically ancient brewing was an offshoot of bread production. It was just, carrying it to another stage, another step. And in ancient Israel, there's just been a lot less work in this area than there has been in neighboring regions, just because of what seemingly, until recently looked like the absence of evidence. It's like, what is the archaeological evidence for brewing? I mean, how do we identify it? It's, rather few and far between until recently. So I and Michael Homan and others, have looked into this question in the recent past, about where brewing would have been done in ancient Israel, who would have been doing it, what kind of artifacts and installations it would have involved. And we argued that most likely women were making this at home, just like they were making bread on a regular basis at home, using the same tools and equipment with the addition of maybe a single container that would have been necessary to brew the beer in. And unlike wine, which is only made once a year after the vintage season, beer can be made any time of year from stored grain. And it also, the alcohol in it would kill microbes, making it safer to drink than water. And it also, germinated grain increases the calories and the nutrient content of grain. So it makes it even, a better use of grain than simply, turning it into flour and then from there making bread out of it. So it makes a lot of sense that people were brewing in ancient Israel, but it's just been identifying the hard evidence for that's been a challenge.
Now, this beer sounds a lot like Guinness. It sounds like, a bread in a cup, essentially, which is so great about Guinness if you're really hungry and poor and only have money for a cup of beer, which happened to me in my early 20s. But in any case, have you tried this beer yourself? Have you tried making it?
No, I haven't. I mean, I teach a course for undergraduate students on ancient food and drink technology. So some students have attempted to do this in the past, and I've tasted theirs, but I haven't made my own before. And it's so different from what we think of as beer today, primarily because there aren't hops in it. So, hops came into use in the medieval period. And so before that, fermented grain liquid would take on a number of different flavors. I mean, it's more sweet. It's more like a barley water gruel, maybe, kind of substance than what we think of today as a sort of clear, hoppy beer. So it would have been, like you say, I mean, drinking your meal in a cup. I mean, it would have been a really rather nutritious and relatively low alcohol content beverage that we believe was enjoyed by everyone, just like it was in Egypt and Mesopotamia. I mean, children and adults and whoever. I mean, it was also a staple in those areas. It just isn't recorded as being a staple in the biblical text.
And do you think that could be a little bit about how all the Israelites, or many of the Israelites, and especially the prophets, were trying to be as opposed to the other cultures, to be distinctive from? And you do note that there's this idea of the Queen of Heaven and the prophet Jeremiah railing out against women for becoming drunk or pouring libations or something like this. There is this culture of women as the beer goddess. Talk about this a little bit too, please.
Right. Yeah. The ancient Sumerian beer goddess was Ninkasi. And we know also in Egypt that Hathor and, other female deities were associated with alcohol. So, I mean, there is something to this, to women being associated with alcohol in the ancient Near Eastern world. This, I mean, sneaks in, I guess, into the biblical text, but not often, so it's only in some places that we learn, first of all, about women participating in these sort of household or neighborhood cultic activities that involve baking bread and pouring out libations to various deities, including, as you say, the Queen of Heaven. So yes, I mean, that could be a reason why we don't learn more about these kinds of things in the biblical text, because the writers were not recording them because they, of course, were very much opposed to them. Another thing that I thought of when you said this, too, was the association between the Philistines and beer drinking, which in the history of biblical archaeology, because we find these distinctive strainer vessels that have been traditionally understood as beer drinking vessels in the Philistine repertoire, that, beer has been overlooked as, something that the Israelites would have drunk and produced. So, and we find this actually with a recent study that was done by colleagues in Israel that appeared a couple of years ago in the news, and also in, was published, that the actual, yeast was isolated from different vessels found at sites throughout Israel from different periods, but including 2 of these strainer jars that are distinctive to Philistine material culture, thus apparently proving that they were used for drinking beer. And I mean, it's really exciting because, I mean, it's, some of the first hard evidence that we have that, beer was being made and drunk in the region, but also it ties them to those specific vessels. So now I think, next steps would be to start testing more vessels, and looking beyond just the strainers and looking at, other vessels like that could have been used as beer vats that are found in exactly the kind of context I was talking about before in the household to see if they contain these strains of yeast as well.
Okay. And do you assume that that will take place in the future, or is this something that you yourself are going to have to do in your next expedition?
Well, I hope that people do take that up. And I mean, I think that that's in the works with some projects. It's a matter of, I guess, having the interest and also, having the money to do these tests, because I mean, it is sort of an extra if this is just like, one small piece of your overall, archaeological project, right? But I think now that there's been success in this area, and I think there's increasing interest, particularly in beer in recent years. I mean, you can see this in Israeli culture all over the place. I mean, that, craft brewing is big business now. It wasn't a few decades ago. So, I mean, I think all of that has combined to make it a really great time to start looking at this stuff more carefully in the past. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have any immediate plans to do this myself, but I think that some of my colleagues are moving ahead with this. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they come up with in the next few years.
Now, you currently are not leading an excavation. What are your plans for the summer regardless, though?
Right. So I will continue working on the analysis of material that we excavated at Jezreel, which primarily we were working in early Bronze Age remains, but Jezreel was occupied nearly continuously from the late Neolithic up to modern times. And it produced one of the largest groundstone assemblages that's been found in Israel, ironically. So I'm continuing to work on that. There's some really interesting material there. And then, of course, lots and lots of other stuff that still needs work. So, the pandemic, of course, has delayed all research for everybody. And so I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about getting back to it this summer, especially in the case where, like stone artifacts and ovens, the material can't come with you or be shipped overseas or whatever. You got to go to it. So I'm looking forward to getting back to some of these things and getting back into the work.
And what do you hear from colleagues and students about the summer and joining some digs finally again?
Yeah, there's so much enthusiasm. I mean, I have a couple of my students that will be working on digs in Israel and elsewhere in the region this summer, and people who've been waiting a couple of years to go into the field. So it's really exciting. I mean, I just hear a lot of enthusiasm. Different organizations have been really generous in offering scholarship money so that students and others can take part in these projects this summer. So I think it's going to be a really exciting season, and I'm looking forward to hearing reports of some great discoveries and from all periods, from what I've heard, that just like there's just going to be a lot of field work going on this summer. So I'm really looking forward to it and being part of it and being able to get back to Israel for the first time in a couple of years.
Great. Now, thank you so much for talking with us, and I look forward to meeting you. I hope sometime in person when you next come.
Thank you. Me too. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for listening to Times Will Tell from the Times of Israel, and thanks to our producer, Gilad Brownstein.
Please subscribe wherever you find your podcast and check out our daily briefing news show every Sunday through Thursday.
Like what you hear? Consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to spread the word.
Until next week.
Shalom.